Let's be honest with ourselves. The knockout blow is one of the biggest reasons why we watch the UFC. But unfortunately, sometimes it comes at the price of the health of the fighter. As a physical therapist and somebody who's been in sports medicine for quite some time, when I watch these types of blows, I can't help but cringe at some of the things that these fighters exhibit after blows like this. So today's video is going to be explaining some of the science behind what's happening after some of the UFC's scariest knockout blows. Alright guys, so the first really good view of what I want to talk about today happens after this really big knockout blow that I think we all remember. The big left hook heard around the world and lands directly on the chin. We get that really good whip on Overeem. But what I want to talk about today actually happens after the knockout. Okay, so after he lands, it's the position that Overeem is assuming right here. So this is something called abnormal posturing, and this is just a position that the body assumes after we undergo something like a traumatic brain injury or anything really neurological related. It tends to be a noxious or a painful stimulus, and then a reduction of a loss in consciousness, so he obviously lost consciousness, and then his body assumed this position. So there are two types of abnormal position or abnormal posturing, and the first one we're going to talk about is this position here called Decorticate positioning. And it's characterized by exactly what he's doing. So it's global extension in the lower extremity. So at his hips, his knees, and his ankles or plantar flex are extended. And then his toes are actually curled under or flexed. And you can actually hear Joe Rogan talk about this in a clip that I'm going to play right now, multiple seconds after Ngannou was already celebrating. And so even though Joe Rogan noticed this, or some of the commentators noticed this, it only tells half the picture, because what actually differentiates this type of positioning from the other type of positioning, Decerebrate positioning, is what's happening in the upper extremity. So we can see that his shoulders are a little bit abducted away from his body. His elbows are flexed, which is one of the determining factors of whether it's Decorticate or Decerebrate. If he didn't have these gloves on, the wrists would be flexed, and the fingers would also be flexed, and his wrist would be a little bit pronated. And then you've got the extension of the cervical spine, which is the same in both positions. So that flexion at the elbow and at the wrist, with a little bit of pronation at the wrist and finger flexion, is that differentiating factor between Decorticate positioning and Decerebrate positioning. Now let's look at another example here. This is Gutierrez versus Edgar. So Gutierrez hits him with a really good knee to the chin. And then when Edgar falls down, he immediately goes into that same position we just saw Overeem. So we've got a lot of tone in the quads, and in the hips. Tone is just a muscular contraction that's involuntary, right? So you can see his quads are really active, his calves are really active. He's assuming that same position that we saw in Overeem. His shoulders are abducted, and then he's got that flexed wrist, flexed elbow, and then flexed fingers. And again, his wrist would be flexed if it weren't for the gloves. Now, the other type of abnormal posturing that we have is called Decerebrate positioning. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, and we don't really see that one as often. And thank goodness, particularly in the UFC or in any combat sports, because it is associated with lower survival rates and can be indicative of something a little bit more serious or a little bit lower in the brainstem. And so I'm actually going to show you guys that and what we're thinking whenever we see certain things. So you can see with this animation, we're looking at what's called a mid-sagittal view. The head is being kind of cut in half from front to back. So we can see, if we just orient ourselves, we can see the nose over here and then the back of the head over here. So we're inside the brain kind of looking at it. It's called a mid-sagittal view. And where I want to hyper-focus on are these three areas that I'm highlighting here. So these three areas, the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla, make up, neuroanatomically, they make up what we call the brainstem. And for those of you who know, the cerebellum sits posterior to that. But these three ones are we're going to look at, and in particular, the midbrain. So whenever we see this type of positioning, we're automatically thinking that something might be happening at the midbrain specifically, and this program doesn't show the red nucleus. The red nucleus is located in the midbrain. So if we see Decerebrate positioning, we are assuming that it happens at the level of the red nucleus at the midbrain or lower. So at or inferior to the level of the midbrain, specifically the red nucleus. And when we see Decorticate positioning, we're typically thinking that it's happening at or superior to the level of the red nucleus at the midbrain. So our primary motor and sensory cortices, Decorticate positioning. Okay, so that's just kind of a little bit of what we're thinking about whenever we see some of these things happen. And if you see something like this happen in your gym, it is Non-negotiable. This person, I don't care if they get up 30 seconds later and they're totally fine. They need to go seek immediate medical attention. This is not something to play around with. Okay, a lot of times people can get hit, they get knocked out, or they lose consciousness for a couple of seconds and they're good to go. I would still recommend going to see somebody if you lose consciousness. But this, if you see this type of abnormal positioning in the gym, it is irresponsible for you to not do something. And if you're a medical professional, obviously you know what to do, and you know to run through your screens and all that stuff. So thank you guys for watching. I really enjoy kind of educating people on what and what not to look for whenever it comes to injuries. So leave some suggestions down in the comments if you like stuff like this. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.